you again. Okay, hello everyone. We are now resuming our philosophical fight companion with the great Adam Narnst. My name is Dr. Themi, as many of you would know if you're already subscribed to my channel. And we just got to the point where Adam was starting to describe how his subjective experiences with violence, say, in this combat sport, which is controlled but still hugely way more violent than most people would experience or than anyone would experience in their day-to-day life, you'd say, generally speaking, but that most people would ever experience in their life. And you're talking about there's a sort of participant observer element in the topic, where if you've been in the topic, it makes your writing more force, and then you're talking about have more force, and you're talking about force or violence itself as not necessarily immoral a priori. Like, it depends on the context. Perhaps that's what you were talking about with rough violence, but these are my guesses and my interpretations. Where I'm sort of leading is the sort of notion of divine violence that people like Bataille talks about when he analyzes William Blake's poetry in his Literature and Evil novel. And I believe that Zizek's spoken about divine violence as well, which, if it's a general Freudian point, it's that after repression, this stuff doesn't come back just as a brute mechanical like series of like, do this, then do that. There's also an imaginarization of it and an affect that comes into it where it seems divine. It seems like it's the stuff of what was typically religion, where sacrifice was always a big part of it. Sacrifice of the animal, human sacrifice in some cases. There'd be games, there'd be theater where the hero gets sacrificed. If there was no violence in the actual play, sex and violence, or in the rituals, then people think this isn't divine. This is just like, everyday life. Like, might as well be at the office. But that's sort of where I'm sort of coming at it from. But I'd like to hear you articulate more how it has specifically thus far worked its way into your research project, and where you think it might ultimately go next.
So I guess undergrad I was history and history, theology, and creative writing, and so I had that background, and then I guess the idea of like a Lebensphilosophy, like a living philosophy, something that, this is the old Nietzsche maxim, real philosophy walks. So I'm not as big a fan of walking as him. But yeah, so that's kind of, and especially kind of a return to something that's a bit more closer to the bone, something that's in the bone, like not. I just, when I started reading philosophy, I couldn't. I always had a very high reading level, but and I could kind of understand things relatively quickly, but the abstractions of philosophy, I didn't like that I couldn't burn my way through them. I didn't like that I couldn't picture anything they were talking about with half of them. And then I came across some Benjamin in like uni and undergrad, maybe in postgrad, and then and he's the one who wrote the essay, that divine violence essay, that inspired that. Basically, Zizek's book is an extrapolation of that. So pushed down to more political dimensions and all that kind of thing. So that registered with me, the idea of this. So no longer looking at violence as purely as physical violence, which as soon as I start explaining any of these things, people think instantly that it's all about physical violence. So we have subjective objective, and divine, the three levels. I think don't they say them differently? Girard says one. Oh, well, Zizek adds the imaginary and symbolic, Lacanian thing to it
And the real,
as
yeah.
well.
So
Yeah.
the real will be actually the violence itself, like to be able to express aggression in that way and be able to like strike and be in that space where you could get hit and you're going to hit and you're going to master someone physically. These are heavily prohibited impulses, which we prohibit for a good reason, so we can found civilization. But it's not as if those impulses aren't still there, and that's the real. That's sort of hidden. It's beneath the bar, so that we could form a symbolic register, which is work, reason, morality, hopefully well-functioning polity, a good democracy, and then. But when do we get to reaccess that real, that repressed material? It happens usually during the arts, right, where it's time for the imaginary, and for religious communities, that imaginary is seen as more real than a real itself, right? Even Plato was saying that, and people are free to like have faith in some aspect of some of the imaginary as being real. From a secular atheist perspective or a scientific perspective, we tend to see the imaginary as the imaginary. Like we don't think Jesus literally walked on water and or Zeus literally like jumped down from the mountain and turned into a bull in order to like hang out with Europa. But we see these as important metaphors for our drives and desires that are finding expression there. So that's the real and the symbolic and the imaginary. So when people like see things like combat sports or any kind of collision sports, right, and they think, oh no, this is bad. Like they're sort of making a register error. Like they're saying, okay, it's bad if Adam Narnst walks down the street and starts throwing like Muay Thai elbows. But Adam Narnst doesn't. Adam Narnst is a PhD candidate and a teacher and a fine chap, you know what I mean? He's my vote for like Australian of the Year, which is coming up soon. So if anyone's listening, or to be on Australian Story on the ABC when the Finnish moral talking about like sex and gender as if psychoanalysis has nothing to tell them because clearly they've read none. So they're making a kind of register error. Like these are important outlets. And same with the arts, when the arts do show tragic themes or stage the real in some way, the violence, the perverted behavior, the sexual behavior directly. If we don't do it in our arts, when are we going to do it? On the street? Because it's going to come out somewhere. And that's sort of what you have to face as a bouncer. Like you're there trying to do a job. And there's all these sort of like Queensland rednecks, I imagine. It's a pretty rough state, even by Australian standards, who are coming and they're going to say, we're going to throw fights in the street and throw bottles and try and jump you. There's 10 of us and we think we can win. And yeah, they're making the register error, whereas you're doing it in the right way. Like you're doing it in the imaginary, in the arts, right? When it's time for play. It's not actually literally real fighting. It's like you say, there's a referee, there's a doctor, there's a promoter trying to put the fix in. So
it's ritualized. So it's ritualized. But it's ritualized, but it's kind of in a weird way, kind of floats between the subjective and objective kind of thing, because people still feel it as if it's personal violence that's going on there, even though it's actually part of the objective violence, the violence that we don't recognize as violence, like the police and the armed forces and all the training that we put into teaching people from our countries to kill other people, like massive portions of every country's budget go into training their own citizens and how to murder and destroy other people. So it's quite funny, it's logical, but they kind of that these reified, like these protectors of the community are these kind of characters, but then they don't really know what to do, and it's like obviously it's cathartic to watch someone fighting in the ring. And it's also a good kind of when you see someone a lot better then you know, it's a good reminder. Like when I start to get some fancy ideas in my head about fighting again, and then I, you know, watch a heavyweight fight, and I'm like, no, no, thanks. Like, oh, I'm all right. You know, it calms us down.
Yeah.
But yeah, same with bouncing. And bouncing is a very kind of, you're working in a very liminal zone. You know, your the nightclub has become something that, you know, where we can overstretch taboos, right?
Mhm.
We know a lot of stuff happens that no one sees, despite the cameras, despite the security. You know, like it's a it's a wild environment. It's right in our suburbs. So
People drink and
yeah,
try to have sex. That's already a sanctioned transgression of ordinary taboos. But once that taboo,
yeah, and if
oh,
yeah,
you know, it's pretty catchy, isn't it? Some people just like keep going, and that's why they pay former MMA fighters like yourself, or soon to be MMA fighters like yourself, back the time when you were
yeah.
good, to keep the peace.
I mean, the club that I worked was like it was in the top. It was part of the Dirty Dozen, which were the first 12 pubs, well, clubs and pubs in the country, I think, to ban all glass. We had like I had maybe 80 odd fights in 4 years there. Like it's just I don't know, like no, I'm getting that wrong. Don't listen to any of those stats. But yeah, it might have been about 60 odd fights and it wasn't 4 years. I worked in Brisbane for 4 years, but moved around to different clubs.
Yeah.
But especially on the south side, which I'm talking about, it was notorious. And like I'd have my biggest night. I evicted 20 people, like physically evicted 20 one by one all night, just too drunk, vicious, you know, like and the we had like 1,000 people upstairs and 500 downstairs, and our security team would range between like 13 and 20, depending. So yeah, it was like there probably went there shouldn't be any more places like it left in Australia. Let's put it that way.
Look, my
Yeah.
apologies to anyone from Queensland. I'm not saying everyone from Queensland is a redneck, and we totally have
Oh,
those in
maybe,
Melbourne too. Like it's 100% everywhere. But there just seems to be more of a concentration of
but
it.
we don't shoot each other as much up there, you
That's
know.
nice. That's polite. You know, it's good.
Yeah.
There's a trade-off. Yeah, more
The
punching, shooting.
the last guy that threatened me with a gun, I told him you can't afford a gun.
What did he say? He's like, yeah, I got it. Did you mean like you can't afford what's
Go
going
home
to
and get
come?
a. He said, "Go home and get a shotgun." And it's like this
Oh,
40 odd drop, dude. And I'm just like, you can't afford a shotgun. But yeah, the best thing about bouncing is actually the sledging. That's actually the most fun part of the entire
I
thing.
noticed you're pretty good because at one point we went to another pub after or bowls club afterwards. I won't give too much details about where we go, but I think we were just inspired by some of the sledging and banter that goes on in sporting circles because we just took it on the road. I was calling you, instead of the pet whisperer, the pet molesterer, instead of the horse whisperer, the pet molesterer, because you're like really just patting people's dogs like you had a connection with them. And you told me that I had earned a PhD just so that I had the right to wear a jumper over the top of my shoulders in public. And that was good stuff. Like we can sell pay-per-view for stuff like that. Yeah, we can make a fortune. But I wonder if I could bring us back to this Walter Benjamin point about divine violence and how Zizek talks about it in a political sense, because one of the places where violence also comes into play is not just controlling population or defending against a rival nation or group or attacking them, but the people actually overthrowing their own government, revolution. And this is something, of course, yeah, Zizek's very interested in as a leftist, and it's actually was the basis of Bataille's critique of the role of violence or divine violence in William Blake. William Blake wrote a poem about the French Revolution, where he talked about his like the fearful symmetry of his tiger, couching on his prey and sucking on the ruddy tide, like the ruddy tide being the sort of on the vineyards of red France. Got some of it here, right? The Dionysus juice.
Well,
And sort of like
I had that book, and I've lost it. I've lost a lot of stuff. One of the things, if you want to go in a lot of fights, I was pretty forgetful before, but I'm much worse now.
which book did you have? The literature
I had
book?
that one. I had the Bataille one.
Oh, Literature and
I,
Evil.
yeah, yeah, yeah. I remember reading the Bronte thing,
Oh, cool.
and it may be in a box in Shanghai. It's, I've moved around a lot. Bataille, there you go.
That's
Yeah.
the one, yeah. And but the interesting thing
Uh,
about Bataille's critique, and this is later Bataille, right? So it's 1957. It's articles he was writing for the Journal Critique, which he was editing. So it's the elderly, sort of mature Bataille, or as about elderly and mature as someone like Bataille's going to get, right? So he's in his 50s. He's turning 60. And his critique of Blake on this was that the violence of the revolution, that Blake was sort of getting too into it, as if like it became too detached from reason. So it's almost as like when we do enter into the realm of violence or transgression, reason takes a back seat, but it shouldn't disappear. And if we just start killing indiscriminately, right? If like the fix is in, so you're not happy, so you like knock out the referee, bite your opponent's like ear off, and then like mow down
yeah,
like the whole like
all
all
the
the
time.
and then just keep going from there. I mean, that's when the transgression goes too far. Or like the people who go to the club you're bouncing at, they have
Yeah.
a drink, they have some sexual like energy in the air, and then they just get carried away, and you have to like take them out, and maybe take them out literally. And it's the same within revolutions where uh, violence becomes like its own end in a way, or the revolution becomes an excuse for the violence. And the whole history, like the historical record, we can be pessimistic about how incredibly like kind of unrestrained we are once violence comes out. Like a lot of excuses which don't really, aren't really proportionate to the violence that's being shown. So divine violence is something we have to be careful with as well. We can't ban it, but we can't be too naive
I mean,
about it.
divine violence in Girard is the point where subjective violence and objective violence collide. So I'm not sure if it's the same one, but so his divine violence happens at that point where a point where you are personally affected by the violence that's maybe
Yeah.
inherent in the system. I never would have got a job with Monty Python.
Mhm.
Um, so like for example, you're bashed by a cop or whatever, or like just
Or
the
by King Arthur.
yeah, or
How did you get to
yeah,
be king then? Why are you king?
but a point where but it doesn't have to be a physical violence. For me, it was the point where I no longer believe the hierarchy of knowledge. So being a lot of, like in the kind of epistem we have in the holiest of holies we have the theorists, and then we have physics, and then we have what chemistry maybe, and medicine down here, bio, then down here education, sociology, and right down the bottom of the pond, the scum suckers at the bottom of the creative, is the people who are making the creative product.
Mm.
So there's kind of the privileging of knowledge or the underprivileging of knowledge uh, of writing for me was a bit of a spur. I mean, and I know that I generally have read through most of. I mean, I target philosophers for what they can teach me now, but I always read for style with my philosophers. So it was Nietzsche and Benjamin, Simone Weil, Rene Girard, Zizek. Like they all have style. So and through my great mentor, who's actually here in Melbourne, Dr. John Mandelios. He's got several books out on Nietzsche, and he's got a new one where Nietzsche the Mystic. But yeah, he's brilliant. We don't agree on everything, but I love his work. But yeah, he put me onto that he sent me back to the ancient Greeks. Basically, he had a look at all my work, and he's like, okay, like I'd finished my confirmation, and he's like, we're talking, and he's like, oh, he gave me a few words, and since then it's turned into my diagrams and everything. But you're talking about this, and he's like, okay, we don't believe in this epistemic knowledge anymore. We have, so you are talking about the argon, the struggle to, like, once you've come through this divine violence moment, you don't reevaluate all values. I think that's a project that Nietzsche never got around to. But what you do, how do you create value after you've gone through this subjective destitution, right? Where you've no longer believe in the value systems that were the foundation of your symbolic universe, right? So yeah, we went back to ergon, praxis, theoria. So ground zero to ergon, the labor, but also the work, the praxis, which is the practice of writing or fighting, the training of what other people have done before, but also the practice, with the different spellings, so that we have the idea of practicing the art, doing it, right? Not just learning before, but developing your own style, in other words. And then at the top, we have theoria. But in the very earliest Greek, the pre-Hellenics, the theoria was, when we talk about theoria now, we talk about it as speculation, right? But what I'm more interested in is the idea of the spectacle, that the pre-Hellenics were more into,
do you mean pre-Platonic then? Like when you say pre-Hellenic, do you mean like pre-Platonic? Like when in the archaic age of Greece, like Bronze Age, and before Plato became because Plato was a 4th century BC figure, whereas before him he wasn't. So
I'll get the book. Just a second.
All right, just to explain, so the classical era in ancient Greece was approximately between, say, 750 BC and reached its zenith in 400 BC. Working backwards, when Socrates was executed, while Plato was about 28, and then he started writing about Socrates, and so that happened in the century after, and that's when Platonism became the dominant. So that they use the term pre-Socratics is more common. Yeah, the pre-Socratics are the sophists, but Nietzsche prefers.
Well, I was thinking of pre-Hellenic because I also like. I found that the amazing translation. The amazing translation of the Iliad. I always forget his name. I can find it anyway, but yeah. So, and then I looked at Simone Weil's. I love her essay of she's got an essay which basically summed up my entire thesis. It's called the Iliad, Poem of Force. And I kind of, in that kind of in that Nietzschean way of going back to the Dionysian, the pre-Socratics, and because I think there's ways to kind of knowledge and understanding that you can't access, or it just takes too long to access theoretically through speculation. Right. I think you have to experience it. And so, yeah, I mean, you can work in those directions, but I don't know. The moments of inspiration come when we're writing anything, hopefully, but there's nothing like nothing inspires you more than being somewhere where someone can kill you, you know.
Exactly. Yeah. Or
if you want to feel a quickening of the will.
yeah. And equivalent is
Which is
an equivalent is probably the only equivalent I would say that has as much force and power is the freshly bared genitals of somebody you desire, like right there in front of you.
yeah.
That is as intense as it gets, as Nietzsche says. It's about, you know, and Bataille too. It's sex and death. That's what religion is basically about: reaccessing the stuff we prohibit around the issues of sex and death. All right, we've got a 5 minutes left.
Well, I think very much like that subjective destitution can easily come through sex as much as it can come through. And there's violence too. There's violence to sex. Sex is not separate from violence. Like
there's an aspect
so,
of it, yeah. There is an element
when
of
there's no, you know, but when there's no quickening of the spirit, when there's no element of danger, is usually when the sex is about to go out the door. Yeah.
The violence can be something simple like an unanswered text message, you know, like what's going on, you know, like the violence of the silence. There's and it's unfortunate to see that
it's whatever affects us. But yeah, I kind of went for the more obvious way, I guess, of finding something that everybody could see as affecting, and in order to make the points about this theory, which I slowly developed this after bouncing and whatever. But I was always still training or doing little bits of bouncing every now and then. But yeah. But so that's my thing now is this model. I mean, well, it's and how do we create value? So I've done a lot of charts and very pretty graphs. So
I have a theory. About how we create, once we've had the experience of divine violence, as you were characterizing it, once we have confronted the real, and in some ways it's a shattering experience where it might not completely shatter everything we formerly knew, but it might challenge some of our values. Some of our values seem to have been based on a kind of not knowing, a non-knowledge of certain aspects of the real. But now I've seen those aspects of the real right in our face, like a fist to the jaw or a vagina to the ear or a penis in the forehead, right? We've experienced them more directly now. How does value emerge?
I haven't had a penis in the forehead yet.
Really?
There's one for
this can be arranged. You come to the right place. But here's my theory, right, of how it happens. Like it's my like kind of a cheeky take on Sartre's notion of the free self, that we construct ourselves or create ourselves out of our action, and that defines who we are as ethical beings. And a standard metaphor for this is like a block of marble, right? We're born, we're thrown in the world like a block of marble. The values are something we create out of it by shaping and sculpting it. It's not as if like the block is morals itself. The block that hasn't been sculptured is like nihilism, no values at all. There's no style to it, there's no art to it. Nothing's being created. However, when values are created out of a negative relation to the block of marble or a negative relation to the real, the material of sex and death, this is how good the art's going to be. You don't like it. You got my fingers there. You know what I mean? Like, if you've seen footage of Rodin's sculpt, like the guy's like he's just hammering away, like making love to this thing, right? That's what can happen. It's like at the start we might be shocked by what we see, and it might be hard to work on it. But after a while, once we master that experience, then we can really create something out of the material that respects and understands the material at a deeper level. And I'm not sugarcoating, like it's not easy. Like some people experience the real and then become like nihilists. The fact that they don't want to create values, they don't have the will to do it. or they think, let's just escape into some like metaphysical fantasy so that I'll never have to think of that thing again. But I think the task of philosophy, and in some ways it's part of the ethics of psychoanalysis that Lacan talks about, is to try and sustain that openness and that contact with the real, with that block, not too close, so it hits you in the head, knocks you out for good, not too fast that we forget what it is, but just the right distance. Like UFC fights talk about distance management. Just have that right distance. You know when to come in, you know when to back out.
Yep.
Yeah. So that's what I sort of offer there.
Yeah, it's yeah, that I mean that's the thing too. I mean it's it hasn't exactly been easy, and there's a reason why I've taken 10 years to
10.
try to finish my thesis. The 10, 7, something like that, yeah. So that's kind of yeah. There's as part of I'm not really I limited my thesis to kind of to some ways I have to watch out for that. But I'm not really showing any I'm not showing any ways to operate violence. I'm only I'm trying to write to explain how it functions. And yeah, so guess that's, but yeah, I've got a lot of nice diagrams, but I just it's kind of when you do a lot of that stuff, yeah, there's a lot of lack of sleep. I was diagnosed with PTSD a few years ago. So yeah, it's a long road to come out of it, and I think that was kind of close to what you were saying, like of it can be kind of an addictive thing for the sake of it. And when I'm not really learning anymore, it's more for the hit of the adrenaline, right? So and then when it's all taken away from you, it's hard to kind of to naturalize, you know. It's like returning soldiers.
Yeah.
They don't usually go too well once they come back, do they? If you know a few of them. But yeah. So but I don't know, hopefully I'll finish this thing and hopefully it'll be worth it. So you never know.
Well, discussions like this, I think, go a long way because it's all about fine tuning the symbolization of the encounter with the real. In your case, with the direct experience, you're talking about your experience of violence on the street, at the clubs, and in the ring octagon. But there's also a sense, like for me, like anyone, others probably feel the same way, especially the ones that don't complete the PhD, that there is a violence inherent in the actual process of writing a PhD. There's a violence inherent in the academic system, the way they try to.
Not many. A lot of relationships are ended in a PhD. Like a surprising amount, a really high amount of relationships, whether married or not, that start off during with a PhD. Not good odds.
Yeah, and then there's the material itself. Like even if you had the most ideally structured institution in the world, it doesn't mean the real that you're talking about is all like sunshine and lollipops, right? It can still be pretty heavy going, which I guess is acting out in a way through the institution of the academy and the institution that it takes its directives from, which is Parliament House in Canberra, of course, takes its directives from the collection of business elites, the richest minority in Australia, who don't often give us the best conditions to create and write this work and form these articulations and these understandings. So I have as much as I respect you for being in the ring, which was like especially good on a weekend when you had a few drinks and you're watching UFC, I also have great respect for the fact that you went and endeavored to write a PhD with an interesting supervisor who looks like he's giving you some leeway to pause and come back when you're ready. Like it's been.
He's a mentor, right? But my other supervisors, they've certainly have been like that. So Yeah.
We'll have
My
to
main
we'll have to get him on the show if this is a
uh,
show. Why don't we get him on one day? Have a chat. Have
yeah,
a
yeah. Yeah, John's great. Yeah. Yeah. He's actually he's been looking, he's like, hey, help me promote this book. And I'm like, John, it's you're only selling a few of them. They're with Cambridge or something, and they're like $100 because they're hardback. I'm like, John, I don't know anyone who's bought $100 academic book.
Well,
You
everyone's
know.
too busy. Everyone's too busy watching like sports and then jacking off over porn, of course. But some of us aren't averse to crossing between like the various elements. So we're running out of time, but we'll have to look into that maybe on a future show. It's been a pleasure to have you, Adam.
Sure, no problem. Yeah,
And
my pleasure too.
and a special shout out to the Richmond Football Club who beat the West Coast Eagles today. This show, of course, watches too much sport and doesn't read any books, but doesn't mean we can't like sports as well.